Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to talk about cheating in tennis and how to respond to that. We did do an earlier episode that touched on this a little bit. I think it's episode 24, so that might be one to go back to. But I think we want to do a more complete discussion on this topic. Josh, I know that when I'm working with players, I hear this all the time: is how do I respond when someone has cheated or is perhaps intentionally questioning my calls to distract me or other types of unethical behavior. And I think the first thing we should discuss is, why do people do this? Why do people cheat? And I think there are a variety of reasons. So when I think of maybe younger players, perhaps 14, 15 and under, I'm more concerned about what kind of coaching or values are being, presented to those players, because they're not fully mature and adults, and they're not necessarily making these decisions for themselves. They've probably been influenced in some way. So I have some, empathy and compassion for the player who's that young and is struggling with line calls. So, and I think that one is harder to figure out exactly why. But, for older players, I have to understand why cheating may occur. They may feel like winning is so important to them that they'll do anything that it takes, and they believe that winning at all costs is an okay way to approach it. I think that sometimes comes down to what it really means to be competitive, and I think we had an episode on that as well, and it's not all about winning, right? There's a lot more that goes into being competitive than that. While other players use cheating or other unethical behavior strictly as a tactic to throw their opponents off, and I think that that's pretty common. And so when we see it, we have to just understand where this may be coming from, and that can actually help in our response to cheating when it does occur, because we want to recognize that this is difficult to deal with. Josh, you were saying before we began to record, it's like having something taken from you. You earned it, and now someone has essentially taken that point, or if it was a bigger point, maybe it's a game or even more than that, and it hurts. It can naturally get your emotions going, and if you haven't faced these situations much in the past, it's probably worse because it hasn't been normalized yet for you. We heard a story during a presentation that Josh and I were doing the other day about a young player who'd never really faced this and was essentially reduced to tears at the end of the match because of the behavior of the opponent. And sadly, it's really hard to prepare somebody to deal with that for the first time. It's almost like something you have to go through and experience before. Say, okay, here's how it worked. Here's what we can do about it. So before we jump into some things that we can do when we face cheating, Josh, just any preliminary thoughts on your part on this topic?
Yeah, I think as a place to start, yeah, that way that it makes you feel is really important. When you're on the side of, of a line call that feels like it's obviously wrong, um, whether it's on a really big point, maybe it's a deuce point in a no ad situation, which we see a lot of in tennis these days, or some other big point, a deuce point, an ad point, even a 30 all point. um, and it could be in a big moment or in a less big moment, but still, if it's a call that feels really obvious against you and it feels obviously incorrect, that feeling of, this is something that is completely unfair, this is something that's been taken away from me, can do a lot to throw somebody off, where somebody's trying to focus on their game, focus on their tactics, be aware of their mindset or their footwork or some of these elements related to winning the match and doing everything that they need to do as a competitor. And all of a sudden, a point that is maybe rightfully theirs is taken from them. And this leads to a whole host of emotions, including anger, frustration, resentment. It can be extremely distracting. So I think when this happens, we want to think about our reaction, but this only happen, we can only do that if we can plan out ahead of time, if you can have a plan for this to happen, because if you play in competitive tennis matches, this will happen to you. It's a fact at any level: junior tennis, adult tennis, collegiate tennis, any level of tennis, any level of the game, this will happen to you. It's very rare to have a line judge on your court for an entire match, unless it's the professional level, even or the highest level of collegiate tennis. It's very rare to have, or maybe it's a national championship at the USTA level or something, and there's maybe a roaming line judge, or maybe a chair line judge at some of the very high levels, but it is very rare to have an umpire there for the entire match. So we know, and we've talked about how one of the roles of a tennis player, which is unique to tennis, is that you have to be your own line judge. You have to be your own referee or umpire out there, in addition to being the player and your own coach. So with all these things in mind, you need to have a plan and be prepared for this to happen when it does. Um, if it's the first time that this happened to you, it's likely that you probably won't handle it in the best possible way. But we want to learn from these experiences, and we want to, um, you know, prepare and have a game plan for when this does happen. And I think that covers a couple different areas. I think that covers what we want our emotional response to look like, knowing that there will be some sort of emotional response. So can we plan that out? Can we plan out how we communicate with our opponent in that situation? Maybe we have the option to go talk to a tournament director, and maybe there is an option for a line judge, maybe not, but we should at least know those options going in. So having a contingency plan and preparing for this situation prior to it occurring, I would say is a big step in giving yourself a better chance to handle the situation in an effective way.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, when I work through this with players, I use a mindset plan or distraction control format, which is essentially doing a lot of the planning you just mentioned, which the first piece really begins with, okay, cheating has occurred. How do I want to play and perform after this? Um, and you probably want it to be, you continue to play your game, you stay focused, your emotions are in control. You really want to write some details about that. And then you essentially reverse engineer that with, okay, what's your attitude? What emotions do you want to experience, ideally? And what do you want to focus on in that moment? And a lot of that is about how one takes control of the situation, but also how do I want to play? What do I want to focus on in terms of that? So I think, it's good to have a format like that of how do I, what's my ideal performance here? What's my attitude? And I think, at least a beginning attitude on this is that this is normal. I expected this. That could be one way to look at it. But then, as you said, Josh, okay, what emotions do I need to experience in order to not be distracted by this behavior so that I can continue to play well? And then what are those controllable things that I can focus on? I do think it's good to know the rules and what you can and cannot do. Especially the junior level, some players don't know what they can do in terms of getting a tournament director. So, for example, I had one player. She knew she could get a tournament director, but that her opponent convinced her she couldn't leave the court until a changeover, which is not true. And so there's a, sort of another example of the opponent doing something that probably knew was wrong, but could take advantage of that. So you've got to know the rules. You can get a tournament director if you're a junior player at any time, or a line judge, and you don't have to play until that person shows up. The hard part is that many of these tournaments there's only one person there. They have other courts to cover, and as soon as they leave, then something happens again, right? But I think it's also good to know, and I know you know this, Josh, just because the umpire is there doesn't make everything perfect. They make mistakes. They don't see anything. They may even end up overruling you in that situation. They're not just there as your friend. Now they're there to really be an independent arbiter of what is happening on the match. So I think it's good to know what you can and can't do. You mentioned adult league stuff. If it's a non-USTA affiliated league, you probably have no ability to appeal anything. I know, I live in the Boston area. We have some leagues, indoor leagues here that are not affiliated with the USTA. You really have no recourse if your opponents are cheating, so you have to figure something else out. So I think that's a good first start. I'm curious, Josh, if your opinion of when, let's say this occurs, what do you say? Do you ask, are you sure? How do you approach this? Because I think there are pros and cons on all of these things. Just sort of in your experience and working with players, what's your best advice in terms of like how to actually engage on the topic with your opponent?
I think the first time that it happens, you can certainly ask that. Again, the chances of them saying, "Oh, actually, sorry, I wasn't sure," your point is just about zero. But I think having done that, it gives you more. Um, it's helpful to have already done that once. If that second time, then you go to get a line judge. So that it happens once. Are you sure? Yes. Okay, move on. Then it happens a second time. And then if you're that junior player going to talk to the tournament director, or if that's your child who's going to talk to the tournament director in that moment, then at least they can say, hey, we already had a situation once. I asked if they were sure, and now it happened a second time rather than this being the first time in a match. And I think the other thing we should mention is tennis is a game, as we know, tennis is a game of inches, right? Many line calls in a tennis match are very small margins, very small, just an inch or a fraction of an inch or a couple inches here or there. And people's eyesight is not always perfect. So, you know, somebody could be making the correct calls and still be questioned on it. You could be making the correct calls and still be questioned by an opponent, or somebody could be making a incorrect call unintentionally. So these are also important things to remember and think about as tennis players, so that we're not always assuming that we are being cheated. I remember, certain players from my junior days where whoever they were playing, they would always be questioning the opponent's line calls, having no trust in their opponent to be a fair arbiter of the sport, to call balls and strikes in the way that a tennis player has to. So that's certainly not the route that we want to take either. But yeah, I mean, as it relates to this, we want to I think asking "Are you sure?" can be helpful, just because it gives you that extra thing that you can mention, if you get to that next level. But I do question how helpful it really is, in terms of actually reversing a call, or making a big impact.
Yeah, and I also think how it's said is important. So I've seen it done in a number of ways. One is in in a very accusatory fashion, which is only going to make somebody even more defensive. So let's say they weren't sure. If you're essentially verbally attacking them, they're definitely not going to change their call. I've seen other players who just say, "Are you sure?" like practically every point. Are you
Yep.
sure? Are you sure? And they're just sort of saying it in a very monotone way, and you get sort of just used to it. So I think it matters how you say it. You might even ask or say something else. Are you sure? I thought that, yeah, I thought it hit the line, or I thought that was just inside the line. Say it in a maybe more tentative way to kind of open up a dialogue that may help. But at the very least, saying it like you said, Josh, the first time puts the opponent on notice that I see what happened, rather than saying nothing, because then the opponent may feel like, oh, he or she didn't see what I did there. That's great. I'm just going to keep doing that. And that can be difficult, especially if a person is making bad calls on their baseline. It's very hard to see that far. I remember playing a men's open tournament, losing to a player, I think 7-5 or 7-6 in the third set. And after the match, somebody who was watching from the window above told me I was getting ripped off on the baseline the entire match. And, came down to something like that. And it's like, that's so disappointing. But I couldn't see that far to really tell that was occurring. So I wasn't able to get into that discussion with that player. So I'm like you. I debate the usefulness of "Are you sure?" But I think if we can look at it as a means of saying, "I see what you did," more or less putting you on notice. I know what's happening here. The second time it happens, if it's egregious, yes, I will have to go get a director or so forth. I do want to make a point here for junior players and parents of junior players, and for adult league players. If you're playing a USTA event and you have played a match in which your opponent has shown unethical behavior, cheating or otherwise, you need to report that behavior to the tournament director and ask that they report that behavior to their sectional office. Very frequently what happens, especially in the junior world, is that parents will put together grievances against other players. They're saying that they're cheating. Yet there's zero documented evidence that there were any incidents at these tournaments. So it just becomes, one parent say versus a player. And there's, just what I said versus what he or she said. And so there's no evidence there. There's no trail. There's nothing that the sectional office can do. So it's really important that if you feel like these incidences are occurring, you report them to the tournament director and you ask that the tournament director put it in his or her report to the USTA sectional office, wherever that you live. And the same can be done for adult league things as well. That's just important because if somebody is conducts themselves in this way repeatedly, they can be sanctioned with suspension points or be suspended, etc. But that can't happen if there are no official incidents recorded. So that's just a point for people playing USTA that you should report these incidents if they occur to you. In terms of, let's talk about the emotional state, Josh, that we want to get into, right? We already mentioned that this can be upsetting. We can feel perhaps robbed, etc. But those emotions are not going to serve us well because we've got more points to play, right? There's more tennis to play. What are your thoughts on some of the emotions that you think would be productive for players to engage with here, and maybe how do they achieve that?
I would say a good rule of thumb is, and again, this is not a new concept. If you've listened to other episodes of the show, is that you want to control the controllables. That there are certainly aspects here that are out of your control, like the line call, like the consequence of that point, or maybe the game. But there are still things within your control in this situation, such as your response, such as your emotions, um, such as how you decide to play afterwards in terms of what method you play, how aggressively you play. Do you decide to make any changes? So I would utilize this concept of controlling the controllables in this moment, and understand, hey, this is the situation, right? And we can always even go back to that acronym that we've mentioned many times of WIN. What's important now? What's important after a cheating situation takes place is what you're going to do next. It is, yeah, yes, it's not, we don't want to just be overlooking what just happened, but we do, we want to address it with the player, think about what options we have, but we need to be able to move on. So we need to be able to put it behind us and control those factors that can be controlled, including our emotional response. So I would say in terms of the emotions that we want in that moment, I think resiliency is a big one, or resilience. Um, because we need to be able to remain tough and remain focused in that moment. They, as you mentioned, Brian, players often do this to distract or throw off an opponent. Where yes, it might just be 1 point, but it could be a big point, and that 1 point could have a bigger impact if it manages to throw off somebody from their focus and from their best game. So I would point to focus and resilience as two big emotions that a player should aim for in that moment um, to continue to try to aim for their best brand of tennis. What about you?
Yeah, I think resilience is an important one. As we've discussed, there are different emotions for different people in terms of how they perform best, but perhaps thinking of some sort of blend of remaining calm, trying to remain confident in your game and in what you're doing. Um, Maybe there's a little bit of, motivation, determination that can come from this, if you can at least channel that into a positive. Because if we don't end up, using the right emotional state, 1 point taken away can become several. And if you have a hard time getting it out of your mind, you're not going to play at 100% focus for that period of time. So that could last just a few points. It could last a couple of games that you're still thinking about what just happened. I think if we talk about how to get into the right emotional state, we can go back to our between point routine. And this would be a great time to use your yellow light routine. Take extra time there. Really focus on your breathing and get your heart rate down. Try to have more space, time wise, between that last point that was just played and the next one that you're going to play. Even if there's been some discussion with an umpire, once that discussion has taken place, go back and take more time. Settle yourself down, so that you can be calm about the situation and you can get refocused, like you said, Josh, on the controllables, what you want to do, etc. Then you have a better chance of not letting this balloon out to being something much bigger than it should be. Because I think that's the problem here is if the opponent is doing this not only to steal points but also to distract you, and you get distracted, you did what the opponent wanted to. And why would we do that? Why would we give the opponent exactly what he or she wanted through cheating? We shouldn't. And that could be also maybe a mindset or an attitude that you bring to this match, is that understanding that's what they're doing and I'm not going to give it to them. I'm going to just remain strong and focused, and perhaps then you bring that to your emotional state as well. So I think ways of reframing what's going on can also help us, Josh, to come up with that right emotional state and come up with what we want to do going forward, so that, yeah, the next point, fine, 100% focused. I'm ready to do what I need to do.
Yeah, that's. I think you bring up a good point about the next point. The next point needs to, after we've thought about our options for this moment and thought about our options for how we can handle it, is there an option to get some sort of line judge or tournament director? Maybe it's USTA league and there's nobody, that's not an option, or it's not affiliated with USTA, and perhaps it's just not an option. So we've exhausted our options for that last point, right? And we've thought about how we want to handle that last point. What we need to do is move on to the next point. And I know we've talked about it, in the past, but that most important point, the most important point that needs to be focused on always is what comes next, is that next point. So keeping that in mind, focusing on, how we want to set up that next point. Do we want to be, maybe there's a gap, maybe it's a minute or 2 minutes of that discussion of, maybe trying to seek out a tournament director or line judge. It could even be more. So there's a gap of time, and then maybe you have to serve, right? How do you want to handle that situation? Again, when we talk about preparation, this is something we want to think about. Um, do you again, I like that you're pointing towards the in between points routine. I think it's really important. Maybe we want to hit a certain type of serve in that moment. Maybe we want to make sure that we are getting our first serve in. If you want to think about what works best for you, or maybe you go to your best serve, the serve that you're most confident in that moment, sort of your bread and butter serve. But again, having that contingency plan, thinking, talking with your coach or with your sports psychology professional ahead of time, thinking about, okay, if this were to happen, let's make a plan, let's make a routine for this type of situation. Like what you're saying, Brian, it's, let's think about our emotional response right afterwards. Let's plan that out. Let's think about, what we want that next point to look like, how we want that time in between points to look as well. And let's really try to plan out all of these aspects as much as possible.
Right. And I think in terms of reframing cheating in our own mind, I like to go back to our analogy of our fortress of mental toughness, our Jenga tower of mental toughness, and how we really have to take care of that. That's something that is within all of us. We have this inner fortress within all of us. And when somebody is cheating, it can really affect how mentally tough we are. It can break down that mental toughness. But we have to be careful to not let it do that. We have to be in a way understanding that, hey, this is an attack on my mental toughness. How am I going to handle that? And so this doesn't work for everybody, but I've had some players who've really liked the idea of going into a match. Maybe they know the player, maybe the player has a reputation for poor line calls, and they go into the match knowing that this could happen and telling themselves, I'm too mentally tough for this to work against me. When this happens, I know what I'm going to do, and I'm just too strong. And by having that sense that I've got this really strong inner fortress of mental toughness, it can really help you bring that to the court. And I think that's something that everybody can practice is realizing, like we said earlier, this is going to happen, but why not build yourself up to a point where it's going to happen, and you know what? It's not going to bother me. I'm too tough for that. I think another way to look at it is, and this doesn't work again for everybody, but it has worked for some players that I work with, is that look at cheating by the opponent or distracting techniques as an act of desperation on their part. Simply tell yourself that the other player, the opponent, knows that he or she cannot win straight up. So they have to do these things in order to give themselves a chance. And again, I'm too tough for that. I'm not going to let that bother me. And in some ways, it gives me confidence to know that playing it straight up, I'm the one who's going to win. So I'm going to get through this, and I'm gonna be fine. So I do think whether you like those two ways of reframing it or you come up with something else, it's important that you do come up with some way of looking at what's going on so that you can respond productively and quickly, so that, like we were just saying, you can play your best tennis on that next point, because we don't want to reward the other player by they steal 1 point and then they get an additional 2 or 3 more because we were unfocused and we couldn't handle it emotionally. So yeah, take your time. Make sure by the time you play the next point, you have calmed down. You've gotten your heart rate down. Your breathing is more normal. You have a sense of what you want to do on this next point. Your emotional state is where it should be with respect to how you normally play your best tennis, and get back to normal as much as possible in that situation. And a big part of it is how you treat your own fortress of mental toughness, and think of the situation.
I think that's really important. What I would also add is, thinking about how you want to respond. And I think an important question, an important ethical dilemma for a lot of players in this situation is whether or not they're going to decide to cheat that player back.
Yeah.
It's certainly something that we see, um, and I think there's a lot at stake when you decide to cross that line and cheat that player back. Because yes, it might feel in that moment like, well, they cheated me, they took a point from me or took multiple points from me. Again, this could happen multiple times repeatedly. um, I should get them back. But there really is a lot at stake here in terms of your own behavior. And once you do it back, even if they started it, you are still cheating. You're still cheating in that situation. So thinking about your own behavior and also knowing that this will lead to a type of reputation that you certainly want to avoid in any sort of region or any state, certainly in an area or city that you play in. Players have a reputation. Players of a certain level know each other, and you will have a reputation, especially if you're acting like this, even if you're cheating, even if you're in a match where maybe the opponent started it and they had been cheating you, and you do it back to them. For somebody else on the outside watching the match, it's just two players cheating against each other.
Right.
So thinking about, how, if you decide to cross that line and engage in this sort of behavior yourself, thinking about, how that impacts your own reputation, thinking about, what type of person do you want to be. And oftentimes, these sorts of things are more important than just one match. Matches, come and go. You will win many matches and lose many matches in the course of your career, but your reputation, your character, are things that are not as easily, not as easy to get back, not as easy to repair. It certainly takes time. So, in the heat of the moment, it can certainly be easy to forget that, to not keep those things in mind. I think the other thing is for junior players, and again, we certainly see this a lot at the junior levels of the game. You never know if a college coach is watching, or if a college coach could maybe be hearing about a certain match or a certain type of situation from another coach or from a parent. So understanding that there are things more important than the result of this match that you're playing in. It may not feel like it in the moment, but having the perspective to know that certain behavior, including cheating, can have a much bigger impact than that match that you're currently playing in.
And I want to highlight that as well for parents and coaches of junior players because sometimes they're the ones who are advising cheat them back. Um, I don't know that any coaches or parents will necessarily admit that publicly, but I know I've heard it. And so it happens. And so when you do suggest that strategy to your player, know that the impact is bigger than just that match or a couple of points. It can be reputational. As you said, Josh, college coach, they could come and start watching the match when you start cheating. Even though you're saying, well, I'm justified because so and so did it. Is that really justification? Is going to the lowest common denominator the way we should behave? Or should we instead be the exemplar, really be the one who shows everyone how they ought to conduct themselves on the court? That has a much more long lasting positive impression on your reputation. And then you can also come off the court feeling proud of how you handled it. And I think that's very important. When we start stealing points, you did it. There's a part of you that probably will feel bad about what you did. And yeah, did you really earn it or not? And so I think it's much more important that you feel good about yourself because, like you just said, Josh, you're going to win lots of matches in your career. You're going to lose lots of matches. That's just normal. And these individual points or whatever, or just individual matches. They just become part of a larger whole. It's probably not even going to be a big deal, say, a year from now. But your character and your reputation, those are big deals. And sometimes people will say, well, it's just tennis. Is it really an ethical or moral dilemma? Well, some of the studies show that, yes, it is. That this kind of behavior, um, if it occurs in something like tennis, it can also occur outside of that context. Because what are you teaching yourself? You're teaching yourself to take a shortcut, or that it's okay to cheat in certain circumstances. And would you want people to be cheating on tests or other types of things? No. But if you told them it's okay in one context, well, why isn't it okay in another context? Very hard to, reconcile that. So I think it's just, coaches, parents need to be aware that cheat them back, take the next point is not a viable long-term strategy for their players.
I think that's a great point. And going back to what we were talking about before in terms of, let's say it is that junior player and, a coach is watching and they get cheated against and they handle it in that ideal way that we're talking about in terms of the response to the opponent, in terms of their emotional response in terms of how they still play and they lose. Could certainly happen. I think a college coach would more often than not look positively at that because they know that in college tennis certainly cheating is prevalent and that being able to handle these situations in an ideal way will lead to greater results at that next level, knowing that it will happen, not completely blowing up or exploding when it happens, but or going down to their level and doing it yourself, but handling it in a responsible way, in an ethical way, um, is the type of person that you're going to want on your team. So I think that's and I think being able to keep that perspective that you will win and lose lots of matches over the course of a career. And yes, we want to be doing everything in each match to give ourselves that best possible chance. But ultimately, our reputation is more based on how we act. And that's, when a year down the road, multiple years down the road, that's more what we remember about it, about the people that we play in. And, if people build a reputation, people remember each other. Brian, I know you've told me that there are people that you played with as a kid that you still play with now, or you still interact with now in the New England area. So it's you know there are more important things than winning an individual match, including your reputation, including your character. um, and when it relates to sportsmanship or cheating, um it can be easy to lose sight of that in the moment, especially when you feel like you've been wronged or you feel like something has been taken from you. So I think part of the point of this discussion or of this episode is just to be very aware of that, and not to accidentally slip to the opponent's level and make that um commit that same offense that they did
Yeah.
because you feel wronged.
Right. Yeah. Instead, try to really make the tough decision. And I often will say that being mentally tough is tough because it forces you to make tough choices. And this is one of those tough choices. Can I be the exemplar here? Can I be the one who leads with character? And that's hard in that moment because you feel wronged. And because there often are no officials, you could quite easily do something like this. And I've had some college players tell me that one reason they cheat back is that it stops the cheating. And I was like, well, that could be true. Maybe that's been your experience, but that isn't 100% correct. It could also escalate it in ways that you don't even want to go to. So, but again, bringing it back to your point, Josh, now you've become the cheater. So, is that something you're comfortable with in terms of that? But I think overall, The point of this episode has been to help players understand that this kind of thing happens given the way tennis is structured, that we sometimes have officials, sometimes we don't. Even when we do have officials, they are human beings, so they make mistakes. So you could easily also get upset with one of their calls. It may not be cheating, but you can feel robbed for sure. So in some ways, the reaction, the response has to be similar as if you got a bad call from an official. And until we get some sort of really highly accurate line calling system that works for amateur tennis, we're pretty much stuck with this. And so it's important to understand that it will happen, and I need to know how to respond. I need to understand how to frame this in my mind so I can be productive and get back to being 100% focused on that next point so that I don't let this distract me, or I don't want to use this as an excuse after the match. Well, they cheated, so that's why we lost. They made one bad call, so that's why we lost. That would be a terrible thing to say, and it's also, not true. You lost because you couldn't handle it. It was really your response that ended up losing the match, not that one point that changed everything. So hopefully we were able to communicate how to respond to this better, because it is a real situation in matches.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really important. I think, I've certainly heard players use that. Oh, things are going well, and then at 3-all in the first set, they cheated against me, and then things fell apart from there. And I think it can be easy to use that as an excuse and to sort of tank after something like that happens, because but really that's a cop out. That's a cop out. That means that you let that one point completely disrupt you from your mental toughness, from playing in a focused, intentional way, and you let that tactic of theirs get to you. Um, so, and again, I think part of this is that nobody's perfect. We want to be learning and improving in each situation. Maybe this is the first time it happened to you and you didn't handle it in the best possible way. Let's try to learn from that. Let's talk that through. Let's think about how you would respond differently. Let's plan out how you will respond differently the next time that it does happen, because it will. And when it happens, if you can almost tell yourself some of these reminders, like, oh well, they're just doing that because they can't win without cheating, or they have to do that in order to have a chance, and be intentional about your self-talk in that moment, rather than saying, are you kidding me, how could they be doing this? So being very intentional and about that self-talk, and again, planning and scripting that out can make a big impact there. Is going to completely change your response in that moment and give you a much greater likelihood of handling it in a way that you're going to be proud of.
I like that, Josh, that we should have a self-talk script for when this happens. Something that we can perhaps repeat and repeat and repeat for several points after it, because like you said, we don't want one point to basically blow up your inner fortress of mental toughness, right? If you think of a Jenga tower, like all the pieces are all over the table or all over the floor. That's not the ideal. And as we get better and better at handling this, perhaps the damage to our fortress is less and less, then to the point where it doesn't damage us at all, and we're perfectly good at handling that. And I think a self-talk script, probably with maybe just 3 easy reminders in that script. It could just be like breathe, maybe watch the ball, reset, some little easy things that you can just repeat and repeat that are nice and basic and simple, that bring you back to the moment and are helpful to performing well on that next point. And so, yeah, come up with some things that you believe would help you get through that situation, that can help you deal with the emotions there, and maybe some of the other involuntary thoughts that are coming from your mind in that moment. A self-talk script can help really kind of block that out a little bit, or you could use it as a way of like when a thought does come through, use it as your touchstone of focus and go back to what you need to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that's what's important after it happens, that you need to go back to what you need to do. You need to think about what's important now and focus on that next point. Because you still have a job to do. You still are in the middle of that set, in the middle of the match, and you need to focus on your game in that moment. If you keep thinking back to whatever just happened, and you start making too many errors, or you're not playing in an effective style and you're losing points because of that, it's no longer because of the cheating in that moment. The cheating happened, and now the result of the points is for a completely different reason. It's because you're not in your mental fortress. Your fortress of mental toughness has completely collapsed. So being able to get that back is what's needed in order to play at an optimal level. So that's where your focus needs to be, in terms of, okay, this happened, we need to be able to be present and put this behind us in order to play our best. And what does that look like? Using that in between points routine, having a clear plan for the upcoming point, breathing, letting go of any of that tension or frustration from the incident. But having, being clear and intentional about that next point. And maybe we lose that next point, and okay, let's put that one behind us and we need to move on to that following point. And it's so when it comes to controlling the controllables, the situation that just took place is completely out of our control. But if we continue to hold on to it and continue thinking back to it, it's just going to control us and ultimately impact us as we play the remainder of the match.
Right. And basically just do what you can to hang in there, keep fighting. Don't let your sort of compete level, your fight level go down because of something that happened. You've got to maintain control over that regardless of what's going on around you. And then we see where it comes out. Just because somebody's cheating doesn't mean you're going to lose. And you can still win that match if you can keep yourself in it mentally, right? Well, great discussion, Josh. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for listening. For more on today's episode, you can check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions regarding cheating, how to handle it, feel free to email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.